Let's start with Andrew McLeod, and I'll bring you back in a moment, Ambassador. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tony. Let me start off by saying to Christophe, nous sommes tous Parisiens ce soir, and we're all with you ce soir.
Merci beaucoup.
There are two things to say very quickly. The first one is, these are now the times to be thoughtful, not emotional. It's not the time for slogans, and to that extent, I'm very happy that we're now being led by Mr. Turnbull rather than Mr. Abbott, because it is the thoughtful leadership.
Okay,
It's thoughtful
it's
leadership.
also not a time for partisanship.
No, it's
so we'll
not,
move
but
on
I'm
to
not
that.
partisan. What
I'm talking
what
to the audience now.
What I do need to say, though, is, and Christophe has said this a couple of times, we are in war. They attacked us. But what we need from our national leadership now is to determine who is the them and who is the us. And there are two broad choices. It is us Westerners against them, all of Islam, or is it us moderates of all religions against them, radicals of all religions. And we have organisations in this country like Reclaim Australia who really are falling into the trap of Islamic State, who are trying to create the us Westerners against them, all of Islam. If we fall into that trap, we're saying we want to fight with 1.6 billion people. Whereas if we define the us as all moderates of all religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, against radicals of all religions, it's a much smaller number to fight and a much more effective number to fight. So what we've got to do at the beginning, Terry, to come to your question, we need to make sure as a country the us is moderates of all religions against them, the radicals of all religions.
Christopher Pyne, let's bring you in.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, Mohammed. I'm going to pick you up on a little bit. It's all very nice for us to say this has nothing to do with religion, but that's not quite true. Religion is used as a motivator for people. And in fact, you can take parts of the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran and take these provisions and they can be used to inspire all sorts of hatred. And across the centuries, different parts of different religions have done so. What we see in this century, because of the impact of information technology, a vast spread of communication, is the distorted message of the religious text is passed to a lot more people and a lot faster. So religion is used as a motivator, but are these people true Muslims? I don't think so. In the same way that a pedophile priest has done such a heinous act that it takes him outside of the spectrum of Christianity, in my view. I don't care how much a pedophile priest tells me he's a Christian, his actions prove to me he's not. And I don't care how much a terrorist proclaims Allahu Akbar, he's not a Muslim by the very actions that he's undertaking. But we need to be aware that religion is being used as a motivator. And that's part of what I was talking about earlier, about setting up the world of who is the us and who is the them. And our language and our words now have to be very, very important. If we want us to be all moderates against all radicals, consider this. When the Charlie Hebdo attacks happened back in January, the tragedy in Paris, 12 journalists were killed. In response, we, the West, a number of world leaders and hundreds of thousands of people protesting up and down the streets in Paris for an objection to the murder, but also demanding the right to free speech and demanding the right to offend. Everybody recognised those cartoons were offensive. Yet a few weeks earlier, 132 children and 9 teachers, including a friend of mine, were butchered in a school in Peshawar in Pakistan because the children had committed the sin of being the children of military officers who are fighting the radicals that we too are also fighting. Yet we said almost nothing. So what is the signal that we're sending to moderate Islam? We will protest loudly for the right to offend you, but we'll be silent when your children die. Is this the way that we create a collaborative partnership with moderate Islam? And you want to know something? I really don't like the term moderate Islam. I would prefer to say real Muslims. There are extremists and there are real Muslims. Moderate Islam are just like all of us, normal, everyday people that follow the God of Abraham, like Jews, like Christians, like Muslims. But the terrorists have stepped so far out of that, I don't think it's valid to call them Muslims. I don't think it's valid to say they're religious. But we do need to recognise, Mohammed, that religion is used as a motivator.
Can I just go back to...
This is something we need to understand. A lot of people say terrorists are crazy, insane, stupid. Actually, they're not. I'm going to say something that might offend one or two people, and I apologise. I'm going to overgeneralise now the Abrahamic religions, and I know it's an overgeneralisation, so please don't tweet the heck out of me. if you believe in God, and lots of Jews, Christians and Muslims do, and you believe in heaven, and lots of Jews, Christians and Muslims do, and you believe there is a certain code of conduct you need to follow that gets you into heaven, and lots of Jews, Christians and Muslims do, then it's logical to follow that code of conduct. It's not crazy, it's logical. So the question now comes is, who taught you what code of conduct? What are you following? You learned yours in your schools. People learnt theirs in their schools, which is why the challenge in countries like Syria and the challenge with radical Islam is a multi-generational challenge, because there are people in that community who have been taught, in my view wrongly, that the code of conduct to get into heaven is to do this sort of thing. There is a rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, who's written a book, In God's Name, not in God's Name. And if you want to understand this dynamic, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, because he talks about a thing called dualism, which is creating the us versus them fight. And once you create the us versus them fight, it's very, very easy to be destructive of other human beings. And then he says you move from there to a thing called altruistic evil. Because you're not doing this bad thing for yourself, you're doing what God commands you to do. It's now not evil, it's altruistic. It's following the teachings of God. Altruistic evil and dualism, us versus them. And we've got to be very careful. They're not crazy. They're following a logical path based on an educational framework that I just happen to think is grossly wrong.
Christophe, is that something the French government is going to have to counter in this tiny group of people that we're talking about, and how do you do it?
I would disagree slightly, Peter, with one part of your question. If you remember back, Prime Minister David Cameron wanted the United Kingdom to be much more aggressive in Syria, and the parliamentarians in Westminster voted no. I was briefing in camera a number of politicians back then, and I said the problem that you've got is by the time you make up your mind for a small-scale intervention, the time for the effectiveness of a small-scale intervention will go. And then by the time you make up your mind about a medium-scale intervention, the window will be closed for that, and then you're going to be left with an unholy mess that requires a large intervention. That's where we're at today. And we've now got to look at this war between us and them in a much broader context. There are the home wars that we need to have with homegrown second and third generation. There is tiny, tiny number of people that are coming in as refugees or supposed refugees with terrible effect that we saw in Paris. But then let me link your question with the previous question in an unusual way, because we always talk about refugees and asylum seekers as a threat, not an asset. Over history, militaries have spent treasure and blood to get spies behind the front lines, to understand the enemy's thinking and where they are. And we now have thousands, no, millions of people who understand ISIS, understand their theology, understand their thinking, who hate them with a passion. And we're turning our back on these people. I look at these 12,000 asylum seekers, not just as asylum seekers and refugees, but in there is the potential members of our security and intelligence forces who will tell us more about Islamic State than we've ever known before. They are the greatest assets we can have in this war, if only we start to look at them as assets. And that is a critical part of this war that we're missing, the whole intelligence place, human intelligence that we gave up on a long, long time ago. But we do need to have the discussion as France, as United Kingdom, as Australia, as United States, what actually are we wanting to do in this war? And if we're going to do it, go back to the lesson from Vietnam. Right. Do it properly.
And Iran to agree that Assad must go eventually?
Maybe eventually. I mean, the thing about foreign affairs is you're not, and leadership in foreign affairs is almost always not a choice between a good option and a bad option. You don't need leadership in a good option and a bad option. You pick the good one. What we see in Syria, as we saw in Iraq, because there are debates on both sides, Nick, about would Iraq have been better with Saddam Hussein in place still butchering hundreds of thousands of people? You know, there are arguments on both sides. And what we've got in Syria now is a balance of bad options. Do we leave Assad in power? Do we re-empower the Russians in their foreign policy? Do we go in and bomb the heck out of it? I mean, each of those options is a bad option, and the challenge for our leaders is to steer the way and find the least bad of bad options. When I said earlier, Tony, that if you're going to do it properly, I didn't mean just militarily. I meant the whole spectrum. And the big mistake in Iraq, in my view, isn't they intervened. The big mistake in Iraq was there was no plan for the recovery and the reconstruction. And the data is clear. If you don't get economic growth in a failed and fragile state, it will descend back into conflict every time. And as strange as it may seem, there was no discussion between military and political planners with the private sector to talk about how do you actually get the economy going again? How do you actually give back to communities something they will lose, i.e. jobs and economic prosperity, if they go back to war? So if we were to do something in Syria and we were to do it properly in my view means reconstruction, recovery, understanding the communities, know how to build civil societies back in countries post-conflict, none of those things were done in Iraq.
Christopher Pyne, I'll bring you in.